Welcome everybody to the session of CBR Symposium on Consensus Protocols. We have three exciting talks. We are going to start with Ertem Nusret Tas. He is a postdoc research assistant at A16Z crypto research group led by Team Ravgarden. Previously, Nusret earned his PhD from Stanford, advised by David Tse and Dan Bonnet. His research focus is on consensus protocols, not surprising, and applied cryptography. His talk today is on consensus under adversary majority done right. Before we start, let me kind of talk about, so you can start sharing your screen, Nusret. But let me start with some logistical details. We're going to have the first 25 minutes for the speaker and just clarifying questions. And I'm going to monitor questions and basically screen for clarifying questions. The last 5 minutes will be for more general questions and discussion. After we are done with all the talks, we may have more time for even more general discussion across the three talks. So with that, Nusret, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks for the great introduction. Let me quickly share my slides. And can everyone see the screen? Okay, great. So hi everyone. I am Ertem Nusret, and I will be talking about the role of clients in consensus. Or more specifically, this talk will be based on our paper, Consensus Under Adversary Majority, that is joint work with Srivatsan, Joachim, Dionysus, and David. Before I start, I would like to flash this important slide on disclaimers. This work was done while I was at Stanford, but now I am at A16Z Crypto Research, so none of this should be taken as advice. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so the focus of this talk will be, not so surprisingly, blockchains. And one should think of blockchains in the context of this talk as a magic computer in the sky. And this magic computer is such that everybody can read the state of the computer and using an egalitarian interface, provide input to it, and no one can stop or corrupt the execution of this computer. Now, this is a really powerful tool because one can use it to support payment systems, voting systems, and databases. Now, under the hood of this computer, there are actually two components. Well, the first component is basically a consensus protocol. The consensus protocol takes the transactions, the inputs to the computer, and enables the participants of this system to basically agree on a sequence of these transactions. And now the second part of the computer is the execution engine. So you can think of this as the state machine, such that every participant, once they obtain a sequence of transactions, inputs these transactions to this state machine and updates the state of the computer. So as a result, I would call this the state machine replication consensus, because what we are essentially doing is replicating this state machine across all these participants, which I will denote as validators consistently. An important feature of state machine replication consensus is its resilience, which is defined as the maximum fraction of adversary validators, the validators controlled by the adversary, such that the protocol continues to be secure. Now, if you have been following the consensus literature, you might have seen many different numbers for this resilience. You might have seen the number 1/3, which typically applies to PBFT style protocols, such as Hot Stuff, Tendermint, Casper FFG. Or you might have seen the number 1/2, which applies to protocols based on Nakamoto consensus, such as Bitcoin, Sleepy, or Ouroboros Praos, or also applies to synchronous BFT protocols like Sync Hot Stuff and its variants. Or you might have even seen a 99% resilience, which applies to protocols, the SMR protocols based on $strong Byzantine broadcast. Now, how do we resolve the discrepancy between all these numbers? Well, it's not too difficult to explain the difference between the first two, because these PBFT style protocols are typically proven secure under partial synchrony, where the network might intermittently become asynchronous, whereas the Nakamoto consensus and Sync BFT protocols, they are proven secure under synchrony, where there is a known network delay upper bound that is typically denoted by capital delta. And so this takes care of the first column, but what about the next two columns, right? So the network model for this 99% resilient protocol is also synchrony. So what is the reason behind these two numbers? Well, on the one side, we have these, we have the Vitalik's blog post on 99% fault tolerant consensus, and even academic papers that recently appeared in IEEE SMP that achieves this high resilience. But on the other hand, we do have other academic papers that basically show that it's impossible to achieve resilience at half or beyond under synchrony. So how do we resolve this so-called dilemma? Well, to resolve the dilemma, we should basically clarify what model we use for the state machine replication consensus. First, we have these transactions that are input to our protocol by the environment. Now, the validators take these transactions and execute a SMR consensus protocol. And now, if you look at the literature, typically what happens is that these validators, they each output an ordered sequence of transactions that is called the log. Okay. Now, another common assumption is that these validators have a public key infrastructure, meaning there is a known upper bound on the number of validators, and each validator is associated with a unique identifier. Now, some of the validators, as I was talking about the resilience, can be controlled by the adversary, which will be a Byzantine adversary in this talk. But these protocols in the literature typically also assume an upper bound on the adversary control. So there's a threshold honesty assumption. So this model of consensus is better called the atomic broadcast or total order broadcast. But this is actually not going to be the model we will be focusing on. Well, our model will include clients, which will play a crucial role in resolving the dilemma of resilience as we have just seen. And these clients are different from the validators. They are not validators, but they follow the protocol's output to learn about the log, the ordered sequence of transactions. So some typical examples in real world of who might be a client is a merchant who uses a payment system, a wallet, or a block explorer. So in fact, what's going to happen in our model is that the validators will output some consensus messages. They do not have to necessarily output a log. The clients will receive these consensus messages. They will process them locally, and then they basically run some confirmation rule to obtain an ordered sequence of transactions. So the logs will be output by the clients. So I have mentioned that for validators, we have a public key infrastructure and a threshold honesty assumption. But what about the clients? Well, for the clients, we are not going to assume any such PKI infrastructure. Basically, there's no known upper bound on the clients, and there are no unique identifiers for them. Again, the clients could be controlled by the adversary, and there will be no threshold honesty assumptions. It might as well be that all but one client is controlled by the adversary. Of course, we don't really care about the log output by the adversary client, but this adversary client might be able to mess with the logs of the honest clients in certain models, as we will see soon. Okay, so this is actually the state machine replication model we will be focusing on. Okay, so if you have been, again, following the literature, these validators, they are typically assumed to be always on, right? They are, since the inception of the protocol, all honest validators, they keep executing the protocol. But a recently popular model, which tries to model the internet scale consensus, is the sleepy model, where the validators could be, the honest validators could become offline intermittently. They can be crashed temporarily, come back online, and then recover their state. So inspired by that, we also have different client models. So our first client model is a sleepy silent model. And this is the model that is assumed for these protocols with half resilience, such as Nakamoto consensus and synchronous BFT protocols. On the other hand, we also have a client model that has always on and communicating clients, and that is the model assumed for SMR protocols based on $strong broadcast. And then that's the model under which this almost one resilience is achieved. So here What we mean by a sleepy client is a client that can basically go offline and come back later, join the protocol late, and this schedule of sleeping and coming back online might even be controlled by the adversary for the honest client. Whereas an always-on client basically is joining the protocol at its inception and keeps monitoring the consensus protocol as it's executed by the validators, keeps receiving these consensus messages. Now, a silent client basically never talks. A silent client simply receives these consensus messages from the validators and locally executes some confirmation rule to output a log. On the other hand, communicating honest clients may relay these consensus messages to all other clients through perhaps a gossip network. Okay. Now, it can be argued that it's easier to achieve better resilience or consensus for always-on communicating clients as compared to sleepy silent clients. But now, if you notice, there are actually two properties that apply to a client. It can be either always-on or sleepy, or it can be either communicating or silent, right? So why do we have to couple those? Indeed, there can be other configurations, and that is the case. We might have always-on but silent clients, or we might have sleepy and communicating clients. Okay, so we have resolved the discrepancy for this 99% and 49%, half and one, for these two models. But now, because we can have these intermediate client models, what will be the resilience for those? That's the question we are interested in. Well, in our paper, we show that the security resilience for all these two types of client models is again half, the same as the sleepy silent case. Now, that's neat. Like, yeah, we have some richer characterization, but does that actually mean that all these three models at the bottom, are they equivalent in terms of security? Well, the answer is no. And to understand why, we need to basically dig deeper into what we mean by security
Sorry, can I
resilience.
ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
On the previous slide. So if you
Yes.
have a sleepy communicating client, if they are sleepy, do they receive a message enough messages to send messages?
Yes, great question. So while a client is sleeping, it does not relay these consensus messages. But what ends up happening is that while the client is sleeping, we can think of it as like there's a buffer where new messages arrive to the client. The client is sleeping. Once the client wakes up, it sees all these messages in the buffer. And then this buffer might also include the messages relayed by other clients while our client is sleeping. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. So then they are communicating when they wake up periodically.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so now let's dig deeper into what we mean by a security resilience. Well, consensus security rests on two pillars. The first one is safety, which is informally, you can think of it as bad things don't happen, or rather, all clients basically output consistent logs. The second one is liveness, which can be thought of as like good things periodically happen, which means once a transaction is input by the environment, it should appear in the logs output by all clients pretty soon. Okay, so now the security resilience is basically the maximum fraction of adversary such that the protocol is both safe and live. But now you can think of separating safety resilience and the liveness resilience. And this would basically mean that if adversary is less than the safety resilience, then the protocol keeps satisfying safety. And if adversary is less than the liveness resilience, the protocol keeps satisfying liveness. And when we think of these two different types of resilience, we now don't have a achievability line, basically saying on that line, what is the resilience, but we have a two-dimensional graph here, right? So we are now interested in the question, what pairs of safety and liveness resiliences are achievable under each of these client models? Okay, so let's resolve this question. Well, here is the diagram of achievable and impossible regions. So the blue means there's an achieving protocol for that pair, and the red means there is no such protocol, like no such protocol can exist. And as you might notice, the always-on silent and sleepy silent clients are equivalent in that case, but the sleepy communicating clients have a larger region than always-on and silent clients. Now, when we were talking about the security resilience is essentially the point that this diagonal line intersects the boundary of the achievable and impossible regions, right? So indeed, on this intersection point is where the Nakamoto consensus sync BFD consensus protocol lie for the sleepy silent model. And again, this intersection region is where the SMR protocol based on $strong lies. Now, if we look at the sleepy communicating clients, we might see that there is some interesting points that do not appear on the other curves, which is we have a protocol that can be always safe and live up to half liveness resilience. And we might have protocols that are always live and safe up to half safety resilience. Okay, so now in the next few slides, I'll focus on these protocols. As I mentioned, for the always on silent model, we don't have these protocols. It has the same security region as the sleepy silent clients. Okay, so how can we design an always safe protocol for sleepy communicating clients under synchrony? So this protocol takes transactions as input, not so surprisingly. Now, what it does first is that the validators, though, execute a certifiable synchronous state machine replication consensus protocol with half safety and liveness resiliences. A typical example is sync hot stuff. And they basically enable each client to obtain the log of this SMR protocol that I'm going to call the internal log. The internal log, it does not immediately become the final output log of this protocol, but it's output by every client that's observing. Now, once a client obtains the internal log, it basically broadcasts it, gossips it through the network to every other client. And now it starts a timer. It waits for delta time. During this delta time, if it has not received any log that conflicts with this internal log it has obtained delta time ago, then it's going to output this internal log as its final log of the protocol. Okay, so now let's see why this protocol is safe up to half resilience. Now, if adversary controls less than half of the validators, then this SMR protocol, if you can see my cursor, maybe this denoted by pi internal, it is both safe and live, which means all the logs output by this internal protocol are safe and live. Now, it means that when the clients gossip this log, and then wait some time, they will never receive conflicting logs. And then as a result, they will always output this internal log as their final log. And because the internal log does contain every transaction soon after its input, we will have liveness. Now, if you remember the previous slide, I mentioned that this SMR protocol is certifiable, right? What certifiable means is that every log that is obtained by any honest client comes with a proof of confirmation of the transactions on this log by the validators of this system, the SMR protocol here. Now, this is really important for liveness because we don't want it to be the fact that if adversary is less than half, to be able to basically cook up like like conflicting logs to prevent the liveness of the honest clients. And indeed, this never happens for certifiable protocols because the adversary will not be able to relay a log or like broadcast a log the conflicting log that comes with a proof of confirmation. So certifiability here is important for the liveness. Now let's look at what happens for safety. Now, suppose a client outputs a log at some time t. This means that the client must have observed this log as the internal log output by the SMR protocol at time t minus delta and must have gossiped it to everyone. It means that all clients will observe this log that is output by the client at time t, at and after time t. And as a result, they will never output a conflicting log starting at time t and later. Now, this means as soon as a client outputs a log, no future client will output a conflicting log, which concludes the safety proof.
Nusret, can I ask another clarifying question about the certifiable part of the protocol? So certification just comes from digital signatures, right?
Yeah. So for this, the example I used was sync hot stuff. Indeed, in sync hot stuff, what happens is that when the validators, they basically, when they confirm, let's say, a log, they can basically send a signature saying, hey, I confirm this log. And then the clients will confirm the log if they receive, let's say, F+1 out of 2 F+1 signatures. Yeah. So this is supported by digital signatures in that sense. And digital signatures are possible to use in this manner because we do have a public key infrastructure. So we do know like who are these 2 F+1 validators are.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Okay, so we concluded the safety proof. So this protocol does not simply live in the theory land. And in fact, there's a similar mechanism used for Cosmos chains. So Cosmos runs a Tendermint, and then the Tendermint engine has a functionality called panic. Panic happens if the Tendermint engine becomes aware of 2 conflicting logs. And then from that point on, Tendermint engine basically refuses to output any log. So indeed, a similar mechanism does exist in some capacity in Cosmos chains. Okay, so now we have seen a protocol that's always safe. Let's see the flip side, which is a protocol that's always live. So how do we design an always live protocol for sleepy communicating clients under synchrony? Again, we have our box that takes transactions as input. Now, every client, when they receive a transaction, or every validator, when they input a transaction that is that comes from the environment, they are gonna broadcast it. They'll gossip it through the network. And the clients and validators, they will also the validators, once they receive a transaction, they will start executing this synchronous state machine replication protocol with house safety and liveness resiliences, again, enabling the clients to obtain this internal log. Now, in parallel to obtaining these internal logs, when a client receives a transaction, it inputs this transaction to a queue of pending transactions. And the transactions are popped from this queue after delta, capital delta, which is a network delay upper bound, plus some confirmation delay time. So this confirmation delay time, you can think of it as the upper bound for a transaction to appear as part of the internal log of honest clients once it's input to this SMR protocol, when the SMR protocol is live. Okay, so now I'm a client, I obtain this internal log from the SMR protocol at some point, and then I also have some transactions that are currently being popped out of the queue of pending transactions that were input to that queue delta plus tconf time ago. And now I'm gonna check for these popped transactions, whether they appear as part of this internal log. So if they do not appear as part of the internal log, I'm gonna append these popped transactions into the internal log. Otherwise, I don't have to do that. And then I'm going to output this this internal log with the appended transactions as my final log. So this is the always live protocol. Now let's see why the always live protocol is always live. The reason is that, as you might notice, every transaction that is input to the network, input to the protocol, eventually appears as part of the log output by every honest client. Why is that? Because the transaction either enters this log through this SMR protocol, or it enters the log through this queue, but it eventually enters the log. So every transaction that appears as part of the log, so no one can stop the liveness. So this is done. What about safety? Well, for safety, we only can achieve it if the adversary is less than half. And suppose this is the case. In this case, the SMR protocol here that creates this internal log is safe and live with worst case confirmation time tconf. Now, this means that every transaction that's input to the network appears as part of the internal log of every honest client before it's popped from the queue of these clients. Now, this means that no transaction will ever be appended at this step here, because every transaction will actually be part of this internal log. And because the SMR protocol is safe, and because every client simply outputs the internal log as part of as their final log, the final logs will also be safe. There will never be any inconsistency across them. So this takes care of the safety proof. Okay, so before I continue, I would like to ask how much time I have, maybe, so I can adjust the rest of the talk as need be.
So you have 1 more minute But given that there are no big questions, then we can take another couple of minutes, and then maybe we'll have more questions.
Okay, sounds good. So then let me basically describe a few enrichments to this model. So far, we have focused on a synchronous network model, but there are also partial asynchronous models which might which might be coupled with our client models. And similarly, so far we have focused on always-on validators. But as I mentioned, there's a sleepy model of consensus where the honest validators could be intermittently sleepy. So now when we have these two network model cases, two validator sleepiness cases, and the 4 client models, we basically have 60 models in total, and then end up with this at the surface confusing diagram. But we actually do resolve and tightly characterize all of the security regions for all of these 16 models. And here is the final result. So far, we focused on this case, which is the case for synchronous and always-on validators. But we could have inspected this case with synchronous and sleepy validators, which is very similar to the top row, except that the result on always safety goes away. This part becomes impossible. Well, the reason for that is, well, I won't have time to prove this impossibility result, but I would like to basically highlight, give some intuition why this is the case. So as we noticed, the liveness of this protocol crucially requires the certifiability of the state machine replication protocol here. However, in the case of the sleepy network model, we do not have certifiable SMR protocols. So as a result, we cannot use this protocol as is. However, you might say this is maybe a lack of imagination. Maybe someone come up with a better protocol that can achieve that region. Well, there's an impossibility result, which I will unfortunately not have the time to cover, but I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. So I will quickly basically flash the diagram for the impossibility result, which goes through 4 different roles. Okay, so now you might also wonder, now we have shown the impossibility of this always safe protocol. What about that curve that we have seen, right? How can we achieve the curve at the top? Well, the way to do that is basically to replace this certifiable SMR protocol in the case of always on validators with a sleepy consensus with a protocol that is secure under the sleepy model with half resilience, half liveness resilience and half safety resilience. Now, and not every sleepy consensus protocol works for our purposes, or at least for our construction, but a few of them do, and we have picked this one in our paper. We modified this protocol to achieve the blue curve for sleepy validators. Now, this basically concludes the story for sleepy validators. And now if you look at partial synchrony, the graphs become a lot more cleaner. So in some sense, the partial synchrony is robust to the client models. And this might give some intuition as to why people like the partial asynchronous model. Yeah. So if you would like to see more details on the proofs or the constructions, please check out our paper. And thank you.
Thank you, Nusret. So actually, I did have a question. How does it work for when the network is not synchronous? And you answered that. But can you just give us a little bit more feel for when blockchains, given that we have many different types of blockchains, proof of work, different flavors of proof of stake, Byzantine fault tolerant, which ones are synchronous and asynchronous, especially that you divide between validators, clients, and so on. So how would you map it?
Yeah, for sure. So you're basically asking which protocols we do know by name, let's say assume a synchronous model versus a partial synchronous model for their security results. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, the PBFT style protocols, they do assume a partial synchronous model because they can be proven secure under a partial synchronous model, which is strictly stronger than a synchronous model. So it's better to prove security in that model if I can. But they end up with a resilience of third. And then as you can see, their curve, the achievability curve is smaller compared to the synchronous. So what are some examples of these PBFT style protocols? Well, Tendermint is one, Simplex is one. These are well-known examples. Hot Stuff is one, and so on. What about synchrony? The most commonly known protocols that assume synchrony are actually the protocols that are proven secure under the sleepy model of consensus, because as we see at the lower row, a protocol can actually not be safe under partial synchrony and live in the sleepy network model simultaneously. This follows from the blockchain cap theorem. So they do necessarily assume a synchronous network because otherwise they cannot operate under the assumption of sleepy validators.
Yeah.
And some examples of these sleepy protocols are like, well, Bitcoin, like Ouroboros Praos, as I mentioned, the sleepy paper, and so on.
Okay, so thank you very much. It's great. So let us move to the next presentation. Joachim Neu will be our next presenter. He is a postdoc research partner at the same group at A16Z, crypto research group led by Team Ravgarden. He is also previously done his PhD at Stanford, advised by David Tse. His research broadly applies to distributed systems and applied cryptography, and his recent focus is around the blockchain era consensus specifically, not surprising here in this session, and decentralized system security. So please tell us about accountable liveness.
Thank you. You guys can see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. There we go. The click doesn't work, but keyboard works. Great to be here. Very excited to talk about this work, accountable liveness. I presented it a week or two ago at CCS. This is joint work with Andy, with Tim, and with Luca. Here's the disclaimer slide again that Nusret already shows, none of which what I'm about to say is business, investment, tax, legal, or life advice. I'm here purely for entertainment purposes. With that, let's get started. Let's talk about accountability of consensus protocols. So you've learned from Nusret, consensus protocols sit at the core of blockchains. Here's a solved problem. If a blockchain suffers a double spend, then who should we blame, right? If there's a safety violation, who should we blame? The answer is if you consider some of these PBFT style protocols like Casper FFG, Tendermint, Hot Stuff, or Simplex, then there's an answer for this question, which is if there's ever two conflicting transactions confirmed, in other words, there's a double spend, then you would hold nodes accountable that have voted for two inconsistent blocks. That's the basis for a mechanism, for example, in Ethereum, which is called slashing. What we're after is an unsolved problem in this work, which is if a blockchain stalls, meaning transactions do not get confirmed as fast as we think they should, then who is to blame? There is a heuristic in Ethereum called inactivity leak that does something to that effect. But what we do in this work, or what we try to do in this work, is to develop the foundations of this notion of accountable liveness, meaning when is it possible to do accountability for blockchain stalls, basically, right? When is it possible, and how can we do it? What protocol techniques do we need? So that's the high level sort of outline for the next 20 or so minutes. The problem we're considering here, just for simplicity, is this atomic broadcast consensus problem, right? So there's input transactions that get input into our N nodes that are running the blockchain. And these nodes are running this consensus protocol, and their goal is to output logs to order these input transactions into output logs, right? Those are indexed, say, by the node that confirms them. And why is this problem hard? Well, they're running this consensus protocol, they're sending each other messages, but whenever they send each other messages, these messages don't arrive instantly, right? There's some network delay, partial synchrony, maybe sometimes we have a network partition. In general, there is a network delay bound delta. And then also, not all the nodes are following the protocol, right? Some F of them are deviating from the protocol. So that's the general setup. And then, we say that a protocol solves consensus if it gives us these two security properties, the safety property and the liveness property, where the safety property is as long as not too many nodes are malicious, right? So as long as F is, say, less than n/3 in the setting of partial synchrony, all the output logs of honest nodes should always be consistent, meaning one log is always a prefix of another node's log. And the other property is the liveness property, which is as long as not too many nodes are malicious, so F is less than n/3, for example, then all input transactions should enter all output logs quickly. It's important to note both of these properties are important, right? Perhaps a bit more intuitive is the safety property, right? Definitely, if we confirm transactions in inconsistent orders, then we're doing something wrong. But the safety property by itself is not enough, right? We need to make sure that the protocol does non-trivial progress and actually confirms transactions that we give it. So the liveness property is also important. So what previous work has done in this, what I called a solved problem, is to strengthen the safety notion into a stronger notion called accountable safety. And what happens there is we sort of turn the argument around and say, okay, the safety property gives us a guarantee, which is consistency, if F is less than n/3. But what happens if F is greater than n/3? Then the safety property gives us no security, no guarantee, right? No property, nothing. It's just out the window. We don't know what about our output logs. And so the strengthening of the safety property with accountability sort of turns the argument around and says, no matter how strong the adversary is, right? If it so happens that the output logs are ever not consistent, then at least we can find n/3 Byzantine nodes. That's a strengthening of the safety property, because if there are less than n/3 nodes to begin with, then you can't find n/3 Byzantine nodes. So the only way in which the accountable safety property could then be true is if there's no inconsistency to begin with, right? So accountable safety implies safety. It's a strengthening of the safety property. But it now gives us more properties, which is more guarantees, which is if the adversary is actually stronger than n/3 and it does cause an inconsistency, at least we can find some of the bad guys, and then maybe we can go after them and slash them or something like this. We won't talk much about sort of the day after in this work. Our goal is only to sort of stop at provably identifying the Byzantine nodes. And so now, the program is to kind of do the same thing to the liveness property, right? So we want to take the liveness property, turn this argument here around and say, okay, if it is not the case that all input transactions enter all output logs quickly, which means that there is some transaction that remains unconfirmed for some node for quite some time, then we want to provably identify n/3 Byzantine nodes. The n/3 here, we have to put a little pin in and sort of revisit what the number is that we achieve here, but that is sort of the program, right? So this accountable liveness is the notion that we want to go after. So a bit more precisely, what does this mean? We want to have the following property, right? If there is a liveness violation, then the protocol produces some certificate of guilt. Basically, think of it as a cryptographic proof that implicates Byzantine nodes. Of course, the non-trivial regime here is to do this if F is greater than n/3, because otherwise there are no liveness violations to begin with, right? Then we trivially have accountable liveness simply because we have liveness. And then, 3 remarks to this. One is, of course, our goal would be that no honest node is ever falsely accused. We have to see to what extent that's possible. And then what do we do with this certificate of guilt? Well, we're going to use this in a sort of a subsequent process to remove them, reconfigure the system to remove the Byzantine nodes or slash them or otherwise hold them accountable, but that's outside our scope here. We stop at the point where we can show the production of this certificate. And then the last point is, how do we plan to go about this roughly, just so that you have an understanding? The idea is, previously for accountable safety, we'll see this also again in a moment, the idea was we go after nodes that vote for too many blocks, right? And here we want to go after nodes that are caught not voting for blocks that they ought to vote for. And you'll see in a moment how that works. So here's how accountable safety property works, just so that we have the side-by-side comparison. And this is for a protocol like PBFT, like leader-based protocols, right? So how do these protocols work? There are different rounds. We call them views. In every view, somebody proposes a block, and then everybody sort of proceeds to vote for the block. And if the block gets more than 2/3 of signatures from more than 2/3 of the nodes, then it sort of takes the first step towards confirmation. Now, if for some reason we see two conflicting proposals, right, we want to argue that it cannot, what happens if they were both confirmed, right? Then we want to identify a bunch of bad guys. Here's the thing, right? If they're both confirmed, it means the first one must have gotten 2/3 votes. But then there aren't enough votes sort of left to also confirm the second block, right? Because it's a rule of this protocol that everybody sort of in every round of voting can only vote once. Right? So the only way in which the second block can sort of also be confirmed is if there is a set of like 1/3 of parties that actually votes twice for both the left block and the right block. And then what we can do is we look at these signatures and say, look, like you guys are giving us like cryptographic evidence here, right? This is our certificate of guilt. You basically sign your own confession by voting for two blocks simultaneously. You should never have done that. The protocol would never make you do that. So this is how we can then find 1/3 bad guys. There's two interesting properties of this accountable safety property. One is that this can be added to partially synchronous protocols without any new assumptions, for example, on message delay. And the other one is that this property can be provided no matter how many nodes are Byzantine, right? Even if almost everybody is Byzantine, we may not be able to find all of them, to identify all of them as Byzantine, but they cannot shift the blame around to avoid that there is a set of 1/3 of parties that will be identified as Byzantine. Okay, here's basically the takeaway of the first half of the talk, which is that accountable liveness is harder to achieve than accountable safety, and it's precisely in those two properties, right? So accountable safety can be added to partially synchronous protocols without new assumptions. We proved that for the accountable liveness property, no protocol can have that accountable liveness property if the network is more often asynchronous than synchronous, and hence also not under partial synchrony. And that sort of formalizes an intuition you may have, which is, well, if the network is just unreliable enough, right, then that by itself may be the only reason why there is a liveness violation, even if everybody else is honest. And so that alone may be to blame for liveness violation. And so if the network is just too bad, right, then there may be liveness violation for which you cannot identify adversary parties. And then, you don't get accountable liveness. The other thing is we proved that no protocol can simultaneously give you accountable liveness when f is greater than n/2, as long as that protocol also has to satisfy some basic form of safety, which is just safety under partial synchrony, assuming that f is equal to 0, right? So as long as the protocol doesn't produce safety violations, if it's run under a network partition, even if everybody's honest, then it's not possible that that protocol also has accountable liveness when f is greater than n/2. In other words, this encodes an intuition you may have, which is that Byzantine nodes can frame honest nodes. If there are too many Byzantine nodes, then they can frame honest nodes and make them look guilty. Okay, to make a little more precise what this phrase "more often asynchronous than synchronous" means, we introduce in the paper a new network model which we call X partial synchrony, which I want to go briefly over because I think it could be of independent interest. So I remind you the traditional synchronous network model that we often work with, right? If we plot over time sort of our assumption on the network, then under synchrony, we assume that throughout time, there is a network delay bound delta, which the protocol knows that bounds message delay. On the other hand, there's partial synchrony, which is that the adversary chooses a time GST after which the network delay bound must be respected, but before that, the network delay is arbitrary. And what we do with X partial synchrony is a model where X is a parameter between 0 and 1 that sort of sits in between synchrony and partial synchrony. there is a point GST after which the network delay is bounded by delta, but before that, the network delay isn't fully arbitrary. The network delay follows the following rule, right? Whenever you partition the time before GST into windows, sufficiently long windows, think of something like in the order of hours, and you further subdivide the windows into views, think of this as a time scale of like seconds, then the network guarantees that in at least 1 minus x fraction of these views, the network delay bound delta is respected. Okay, which of these views are synchronous or asynchronous? That's up to the adversary. But if you look at a window, then you know that a certain minimum fraction of the views must satisfy the network delay bound. Okay, so this is our network model that we work with, and it's kind of nice because it sits between synchrony, which is zero partial synchrony, and partial synchrony, which is 1 partial synchrony. Okay, so this is basically the first half of the talk, right? We showed that there's no hope to get this accountable liveness property if f is greater than n over 3 in majority asynchronous executions. This means x partial synchrony with x greater than half. And there is no hope to get it if f is greater than n over 2, even assuming synchrony. Right? And at the same time, this accountable liveness is vacuous if f is less than n over 3 in majority synchronous executions, because then we just have liveness. So the best we can hope for is that we would achieve accountable liveness if f is less than n over 2 under majority synchronous executions. And that's in fact what basically this, in the next 5 minutes, I'll explain to you the main result of the paper. That's in fact what we show. Right, so the main result of the paper is the following theorem. We can augment the Tendermint protocol, and this construction is pretty generic. It works for other PBFT style protocols as well, like Casper FFG or Hot Stuff or Simplex. We can augment the Tendermint protocol so that, as usual, we get the usual security properties of a partially synchronous protocol. If f is less than n over 3, then the protocol is safe and live after GST with expected latency in the order of the network delay delta in partial synchrony. But we get an extra functionality, which is if f is less than n over 2, then the protocol is accountably live if it's run in x partial synchrony for some x less than half. Okay. How do we construct this protocol? We start from Tendermint. I'll remind you, Tendermint is this PBFT style protocol that proceeds in views. Every view has the following structure, right? We first send it has a designated leader. Everybody sends a catch-up message to the leader, basically telling the leader where we left off the consensus decision in their opinion, sort of in the previous view. And then the leader can use all these catch-up messages to form a proposal that everybody can get behind, hopefully, if the leader is honest. The leader sends out that proposal, and then we do 2 rounds of voting to basically say, yes, this proposal is acceptable to me. Okay, let's do it. Right? And then the block, that proposal is confirmed, and we have added a block sort of to our output logs. And so what we do in the accountably live version of Tendermint is we add some logic to each view. Namely, all nodes rebroadcast the messages that they receive, and they monitor which messages they receive from which other nodes. Okay, this sounds a bit complicated, but it's actually pretty simple, right? In most blockchains, we have these gossip-based kind of communication protocols, and all that happens here is when I get a message as part of gossip, of course, I make it available to others. That's what gossip means. And then also I take note of the fact, okay, I saw this message. It came from Nusret at this particular point in time, for example. And of course, we're going to do something with that information. Namely, if a node P observes a node Q failing to send a message that it should have sent, assuming synchrony, then P blames Q for that in that view V. Right? So if Nusret, for example, sees that I sent him a catch-up message because I was sending a catch-up message also to the leader, and the leader maybe has forwarded it. And then Nusret knows what catch-up message I sent. And then the leader makes a proposal, and Nusret sees what proposal the leader proposed. And then he still doesn't see a vote from me for that proposal. Then Nusret says, well, assuming we're under synchrony, I know that Joachim must have gotten all these messages. So he got a proposal that was acceptable to him, and still he didn't vote for it. Now that's blameworthy, right? And then nodes exchange information about who they blamed and when. And if a transaction remains unconfirmed for too long, then Byzantine nodes can be identified as guilty based on this blame accounting, right? Based on some combinatorial structure in who blames whom in what view. Okay, how exactly does this work? So in order to understand why this works, we have to look sort of, what happens with these blame messages when there is no liveness, right? So suppose there is a view in which there is no liveness, right? Here are some reasons why a Tendermint view may fail to confirm transactions. The most obvious one is, okay, if there's asynchrony during that view, right? Message delays exceed delta, then maybe I haven't even heard of the proposal. That's why I didn't vote for it. That's why that proposal didn't get enough votes, and that's why that proposal wasn't confirmed. Right? Or maybe the network is actually synchronous, but I'm just not participating. I'm withholding my votes for the block. And then the third option is some sort of shenanigans. Maybe the leader didn't, propose its block in time or something like that. For now, we're going to assume point 3. That there's actually a pretty easy tweak to deal with that. But yeah, check out the paper how that works. We're going to assume that the leader is honest, just to make the argument a bit more manageable. So suppose the leader is honest, right? And suppose a Tendermint view fails to confirm transactions, meaning at the end of the view, there just aren't enough votes. There are not 2 quorums for the proposal, right? Then there's 2 cases, right? Either we're in a synchronous view or we are in an asynchronous view. If we are in a synchronous view, luckily, that happens more often than asynchrony, right? Because we've assumed that we're under X partial synchrony, where the fraction of asynchronous views in this window that we're considering is less than half, right? So most of the majority of the views are synchronous. The good thing, if we're under synchrony, is that honest nodes don't blame each other, right? Because Nusret sees my catch-up. Nusret sees the leader's proposal. The leader was assumed to be honest, so the proposal is consistent with my catch-up. We assume synchrony, so I get the proposal, I vote for the proposal. Nusret sees that I voted for the proposal, and so he doesn't blame me, right? Because I'm not missing. I have done what I was supposed to do according to the protocol. But the key point is, if there is still no confirmation in a synchronous view, it means that at the end of the view, there are votes missing from at least n/3 Byzantine nodes, and they're missing for all honest nodes. And so all honest nodes know that these nodes have sent a catch-up. They've gotten a proposal that was acceptable to them from the leader because the leader is honest, but they still haven't voted for the proposal. And so the honest nodes, all the honest nodes blame that subset of n/3 Byzantine nodes. Right? So those nodes are majority blamed because they're blamed by more than n/2 nodes. They're majority blamed because they're blamed by all the honest nodes. And that's going to be important. And then the other side is what happens under an asynchronous view, right? Luckily, that doesn't happen as often as synchrony, but then all bets are off, right? Honest nodes can blame other honest nodes. Adversary nodes can blame honest nodes and so forth. We don't know much. Okay, how do we, among all these blame messages, how do we find nodes guilty? Here's the intuition, right? We're going to identify a node as guilty if it is majority blamed in a majority of views. Okay, it's blamed by a majority of nodes in a majority of the views. Here's something good about this rule, right? That's our rule, how we're going to parse the blames into assigning guilt, into what makes a certificate of guilt for a node. The good news is no honest node will ever be found guilty, right? Why? Because honest nodes are not blamed by any other honest node in every synchronous view, but the synchronous views are the majority of the views. So in a majority of the views, an honest node is not blamed by a majority. So this rule can never apply, cannot apply to an honest node, assuming that f is less than n/2. The bad news is this rule by itself is not guaranteed that you can find any Byzantine node guilty. The good news is you can restrict this idea to a specially selected subset of views, such that you can come up with a cute combinatorial argument that guarantees that you are able to find nodes guilty. I can't talk through that combinatorial argument. It's a bit involved, but you can check out the paper to do that. Yeah, so that basically makes the mechanism work and establishes this theorem. And the remaining question we should be talking about in the last minute now is how many Byzantine nodes can be found guilty by this mechanism, right? I've only suggested here, right, that we can change this argument so that we can find one node guilty or something like this, right? So how many nodes can we actually find guilty? So we can plot this, right? We have a bunch of parameters here. So on the x-axis, we're plotting this x parameter for the x partial synchrony model. On the y-axis, we plot how many adversaries, what fraction of nodes can we identify as adversary? And then the different plots are sort of different maximum adversaries that we want to tolerate. Right? So if we go to the kind of extreme case, for example, where we want to tolerate up to 49% adversary and a network up to half, right? Then would be operating up to half asynchronous, right? Then we'd be operating over here, right? And now we can plot sort of the fraction of nodes that our scheme can identify as Byzantine, right? And then you'll see that our scheme that we have in the paper actually, we can prove that it identifies one adversary node, right, which is like a fraction of like close to zero of like all the nodes, right? But this is in the extreme regime of like, the network being almost as asynchronous as it is synchronous, and being, almost an adversary majority, right? Almost as many adversary nodes as honest nodes. If, for example, we back away in terms of this parameter x to something like x equals a third, then we can identify a sixth of all the parties as adversary, even tolerating a maximum adversary of 49% whenever there's a liveness violation. Now you can ask, okay, is this good? Is this, how good is this scheme, right? And so we have in the paper an impossibility result sort of complementing this, which shows that what identification of adversary parties you can hope to get for classical PBFT style protocols. And we conjecture that this bound also holds for all protocols, but we only have a proof for PBFT style protocols. And that shows, for example, that this 1/3 point here is actually the best that you can hope to achieve. Right. But for example, in the regime where x is close to half, there is a gap here, and we don't know whether the impossibility has to be improved or our scheme has to be improved. Good. With this, I wrap up. We've talked about this definition of accountable liveness. We've talked about this X partial synchrony network model. We've talked about the unachievability of accountable liveness for f greater than n over 2, even if you assume synchrony, and for f greater than n over 3 under X partial synchrony with x greater than half. We've talked about our scheme, which shows that accountable liveness is achievable under X partial synchrony when f is less than n over 2 and x is less than half. Treat our protocol as a sort of a proof of concept. I think more research is needed to streamline this, improve communication efficiency and latency of this protocol. We've talked a little bit about upper bounds and lower bounds on the number of Byzantines that can be identified as guilty after a liveness violation. And repeat, there continues to be a gap there that would be interesting to close. If you want to know more, check out the paper. It's on ePrint, of course, and happy to discuss more.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joachim. So I have one question. We don't have time for much more, although I do encourage, I don't think I need to say this is how we always do. Please put your questions into Q&A window. So maybe later at the end we have more time for discussion. But right now I just wanted to ask one question. We have a number of proof of stake protocols and that are slashing validators for inactivity, for downtime. So this seems to be a form of this accountable liveness. How does it fit? And I don't think they're using that protocol. So how does it fit into this analysis here? They assume that no more than half of the validators are Byzantine, and how would you compare it?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way I think of it is our goal is to sort of precisely tie down sort of the definitions for this and what these mechanisms are trying to do. Because for all these mechanisms, I have yet to see one that sort of comes with a precise statement of, okay, we have this mechanism and here is sort of the property that it gives, right? I would describe them sort of mostly as heuristic. So we're trying to sort of tie down, okay, what are these mechanisms, sort of what is their goal at the end of the day, and to then explore under what circumstances can you hope to actually achieve that goal, right? So I think, for example, this limitation on like, that you have the network to be, not too crazy, right? And that you have to not have too many adversary nodes to even run a mechanism like this. I think that's that I haven't seen that pointed out, and that's what we're sort of trying to shed more light on.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. Let's move to the final speaker of the session. So Jacob Leshno is a professor at University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. And he has been working on economics of blockchain and economics of consensus mechanism for a very, very long time. He's one of the first economists to take on this question. And he also is one of not that many economists that successfully works with computer scientists. So looking forward to your presentation about the economic security of permissionless consensus.
Thank you so much, Hanna. It's delightful to be in this session. I really enjoyed Nusret and Joachim's talk, and it's great to be here, talk to all of you. And I kind of feel like I calibrated my talk differently. It's going to be much less technical, but hopefully it will still be of some interest. So let me start from like the motivation for like this work. So we started, I started working, thinking about how Bitcoin works, and in particular, how the transaction market for Bitcoin works. So thinking of Bitcoin as like a marketplace where there's some computers that will run the backend, and there's some users who want to process the transactions, and the protocol designs the rules for how much users pay, how much do we need to pay for the infrastructure. And I found it very interesting as a different market design, and in particular that it has very different properties from a lot of the other systems we have. It has sort of a free entry condition, what economists would call free entry. If you want to be part of the Bitcoin backend, you can just come and go. Like if you want to be a miner or a node in Bitcoin, you can just come and go. And that's a very strong property in economics. Like you want to have this as a tool for competition that removes a lot of pricing power. And what we found in the previous paper with Guru Huberman and Siamak Monami, that indeed it kind of creates a marketplace where none of the participants have pricing power, and there's some asterisks to that, but like under some assumptions, you get competitive pricing fees. But at the same time, you look at Bitcoin and you say, well, there's a lot of things that don't seem right about it. One thing that kind of often is asked is, how much mining should Bitcoin have? And it doesn't seem like the protocol is calibrated to give a particular answer. And when you ask, can we reduce the amount of mining? It's wastes a lot of electricity. Well, we have safety concerns about the protocol. And even with the mining, we have a lot of papers that I'm sure you all know that are concerned with the safety of those protocols. And when we try to think, can we do a different design? Those are the two properties that felt the most kind of in tension with each other. On the one hand, we want to benefit from the open structure of those protocols, but if it's open, it means that adversaries can be part of the system and potentially attack it. Can you actually get the positive sides of this decentralized kind of systems without the security concerns? So to understand what are the design constraints, I worked with Rafael in Elaine, with two great computer scientists, trying to understand what are the constraints, what are the design possibilities. And as an economist, I felt like I quickly realized that the real challenge is the consensus part. Like that's kind of what we're talking about all through the session today. If you can solve consensus in a secure way, then you'll have a secure system. And it's a challenging question, not just because consensus is a problem that has been studied since the 80s and there's a lot of rich literature, but also when you think of an open system, there's new challenges. Like when you talk about the system is secure, if you have certain majority, well, in an open system, the composition of the system is completely endogenous. If you tell me that I have a guarantee that the system is secure as long as the attacker does not control half, you're basically saying to attacker, you can attack, you just need to get more than half. And that leads very well. One approach to answer that is Joachim's talk, to say, well, when we need accountability, maybe we need to be able to punish. Or Nusret's talk is like, maybe we need to push the bounds on what are like those kind of bounds. And what we're going to do is try to do kind of both. Or kind of try to come up with a definition for what we think is security given an economic environment, and try to ask, is there a tension between security and openness, or can we actually achieve both? So a couple of motivation slides that's maybe not necessary for this crowd, but we have a lot of systems that do transaction processing that have all the functionality that blockchains can provide. What's the problem with them? Well, traditional payment systems have network effects, they're concentrated. The fact that there's one operator, let's say Visa, that operates a network, gives this operator a lot of power. And there's a lot of antitrust litigation, sometimes addressed by regulation. The previous paper I talked about looked at Bitcoin as an open marketplace where the backend is provided by miners that can come and go, that have this free entry property. And we looked at it empirically also and found that the transaction fee seems to match a competitive model. If you think of transaction fee getting determined by a sort of a bidding between the users on which transaction is worth the most, which one should get in, it explains the data relatively well. And subsequent papers kind of looked at like similar analysis of transaction fees. And if the miners can come and go and they're completely replaceable, it seems like they don't have much market power. So we want to take this open and secure properties. And first thing, I want to kind of think about how to define those open and secure. So let me start by thinking just about a merchant. Think of a merchant in a farmer's market. They're trying to process a transaction. First thing to kind of observe about this merchant is that what the merchant cares about is not what they think about the transaction. They care about what others think. So I'm in the farmer's market. I'm trying to charge $12 for a tomato, and I'm getting a transaction. I don't really care whether my terminal says it's okay or not. I don't really care whether I think it's okay. I care whether the bank will actually credit me the $12 once I get to the bank. In a permissionless blockchain, in a distributed systems, I care that other people will accept the funds that I got. And why would they not accept it? Well, there's all sorts of problems with transactions all the time. Some are pretty easy to check, like a physical check will have all sorts of safety features. Your credit card will have the hologram. And those are kind of maybe the first safety features that are visible, but like those are not actually the challenging points. Those are pretty easy to verify for the merchant in the farmer's market, especially if those involve cryptography, that you just run computation and you check, is this transaction properly signed? My computer can check it just as well as the bank. The really hard thing is, I don't know whether this transaction is actually valid in the context of what the bank knows. Because I don't know whether the account has sufficient funds, maybe there's conflicting transactions. The bank knows because they have their computer, but if I don't see the bank's computer, it's hard for me to verify. And this is essentially the consensus problem. That's kind of the core problem of distributed systems. How can I make sure that my computer, my terminal, my payment terminal, agrees with the bank's terminal? Like, I need to resolve conflicts. I need to, in the language that we just used in the previous session, create an agreed ledger that we all have the same equivalent copies of. And this is challenging because we all have our local copy. We want to pretend as if there's one global copy. And I like kind of using the Bible as an analogy. When we talk about the blockchain, we kind of make the abstraction that there's one blockchain. There's not one, there's many copies that are held in different computers, but they all should agree with each other. In the same way that there's no canonical copy of the Bible, but when we say the Bible, we all know what we're talking about. And when we start thinking about why this is difficult, the distributed systems models will say you need to think about communication delays. Not all nodes see exactly the same thing. And the fact that you saw something doesn't mean that somebody else, even if they're honest, even if they're trying to follow the protocol as best they could, maybe they didn't see exactly the same set of messages that you did because of network delay. And for all that I'm going to talk to you today, I'm going to think of synchrony with the delta lag, and echo, meaning that all the nodes gossip whatever they saw. So like, but even under this model, like, you may not see exactly the same thing as other people. And a couple of challenges that for the economic properties are important. We want the nodes to be replaceable, to join and leave. And that's going to be challenging because if a node joins later after the start of the execution of the protocol, it doesn't get to see everything that happened before. It may get some information, but for example, it doesn't know whether a message got sent like an hour ago or 2 hours ago. Timestamps are not reliable. And nodes may be malicious. Maybe there's an attacker, and the attacker may control a large fraction of the nodes. So we design a protocol. The protocol tells each node, given the private information, the local state, what to do. And you require consistency of the logs of those nodes. Well, I'm going to use the word finalize to say that you wrote something into the log. You may get some messages and have them pending for a while. Once you finalize it, you tell the users of this computer that you're sure that this transaction either went through or not. Then you must agree with everybody else. And of course, a trivial way to satisfy consistency is never to finalize anything. So liveness is, of course, necessary as well. So let's go back to the merchant. The way I think of the merchant, I'm not going to make distinction between nodes and clients. I'm just going to think of the merchant as having some node. The node try to decide whether the transaction went through or not. And consistency is exactly the property that I need to guarantee safety or security for this merchant. If I tell you that your computer sees the same thing, like when your computer sees the transaction went through, the bank's computer will also say the same thing, then the merchant is secure, the merchant is safe. It knows that when its computer terminal told you that you got paid for this tomato, indeed you can use this credit later. So the way we'll define security for the distributed system, for the protocol, is to say, given an environment, given an economic model of what that attacker can do, the security of the system is the cost of the attacker to violate consistency. As long as you don't violate consistency, the users are safe. You cannot deceive them. If it's impossible to deceive the users, that's great. But if it's possible, the only way that you can quantify the difficulty is by cost. Cost is going to be meaningful to an end user that does not know what protocol they're using, does not need to know, look into the black box. But they may need to know, I need to restrict myself to transactions of $1,000. So it will never be worth the cost of an adversary to deceive me, because deception costs like $100,000. as long as I'm at $1,000, I'm fine. So that's very much in line with the same kind of approach that we saw in the previous two talks and the approach in distributed system, but it slightly changes what our objectives are and what kind of goals the protocol is trying to achieve. So next thing I want to do is just try to think of like the open protocol that runs Bitcoin and try to think about how does that perform. So I guess I don't need to recap how Bitcoin works. The important thing that I do want to mention is that the Bitcoin has the longest chain rule that is really essential because even two honest nodes may mine blocks at the same time. So if you see the last block on the chain, you can't be sure that that's going to be part of everybody's ledger. Maybe you saw this block, maybe somebody else has another block that you just didn't see yet. Two honest nodes may mine blocks within the same time, meaning that they just did not hear of each other at the time that they created a new block. So that creates some conflict. The way that Bitcoin resolves this is saying that look at the longest chain. The longest chain should be the longest chain in everybody's view because it's really unlikely under honest majority assumption that we'll have multiple chains that are really long and can run in parallel. So chop the end. If something is KD, often K is used by 6, here it's 4, then you can finalize. Then you can be sure that like this transaction is never going to be reverted and everybody else saw it. Okay? And we have like consistency proof for this protocol, assuming honest majority or network aware honest majority. But I guess everybody here knows also that you can attack this protocol. And that attacks, let me kind of give one version of the attack that just will highlight how problematic it is. That suppose you can mine blocks just like at a fixed cost per hash. An attacker just needs to mine a bunch of blocks faster than on this chain. So suppose an attacker tried to trick node I in this picture. The attacker will just wait until node I finalizes the last block that is finalized here, and then just mine another chain that extends a different block that kind of cuts off this block. Longest chain rule says everybody just switches to the pink blocks now and does a consistency violation. And kind of inherent in the fact that you managed to convince everybody to move to another chain is that you're not really detected as an attacker. You convince everybody to switch chains. From the perspective of the protocol, at least verbatim, you're now the honest miners. You are the creator of the chain that is the log that we're all using. And if you if the protocol does not detect that you are malicious, it does not punish you. Quite the opposite, actually. You're going to get the reward for making a lot of blocks in the consensus chain now. Okay? So Hanna has like zero cost attack papers. This kind of makes a much weaker kind of version of the argument that they make very nicely in their paper. But basically, the attack is costless. Okay? Can we address this? Is that impossibility result? Seems like incentives are going to be just very problematic. We go over what happens with fixed costs. With fixed costs, you also have some problem with tragedy of the commons. But if you think about like a different level of knowledge, let's say, did you trick the nodes, the verbatim protocol, or did you actually trick the people? Well, there's something very weird about this attack, because think about a hacker that goes into the bank's computer, changes the account balance to give himself $50,000, but leaves a sticky note for the clerk tomorrow morning to say, I changed the account numbers. That's the account that I changed, by how much? Well, this is a very weird thing to do. The hacker did not achieve anything. The only thing that the hacker caused is the clerk in the morning will just change the numbers in computer back to normal, and that hack had no effect. And by the way, I asked ChatGPT to make picture of a hacker. It refused to make a picture of a hacker, so it made a sticky note that like the person is a lawyer that changed the amount by court order. But if everybody knows that we put the wrong numbers on the computer, there's kind of an immediate answer, like, can't the community just revert back? Can the community just like restore the blockchain to the right values? And on one hand, this seems correct. On the other hand, this seems very strong, and we should be careful not to overuse it. And the first question is, can the community actually detect the attacks? Well, let's say that you're a node, and suppose you were in line at the time. Well, you see a bunch of blocks arriving at some intervals, and then attack blocks come, but the attack blocks come way longer than they should have under synchrony. So obviously you can detect them. So this node can detect that there was an attack, but still we want to be careful because we want to be, we want to make sure that not only node I can detect the attack, node I needs to be sure that it knows what to revert to. And it needs to be sure that other nodes also agree with it. Because it's not just that somebody in the community can detect, it's that we also need agreement among the community that an attack happened and how to revert back. And if you're not careful, well, you just assume that the community can just solve on conflict. Why doesn't the community just process all the blocks without the blockchain? So how do we proceed from here? Well, we think that this kind of gives us some direction to think that the community response, the fact that those attacks are in some sense detectable, should be very strong. One anecdote about this is that Ethereum Classic got attacked multiple times. Ethereum was not. Okay? That seems pretty sensible, but can we kind of formalize it a bit? So what we do is we say you can actually take this logic and put it in a consensus protocol that will look a lot like the protocols that Nusret mentioned in the first talk. So first kind of goal is that the protocol should prioritize consistency. There's no reason to make progress with financial data unless you can guarantee consistency. I don't want my terminal to say my transaction processed. I want my terminal to only say that if the bank will actually give me money. So consistency should be prioritized over liveness. And then we kind of think of the community response, and we want to think of, well, can we actually get agreement among the community? And also, can we be sure that the community can detect any attack, not just like the blunt attack that we just mentioned, but give a more general guarantee? And the approach we take is, let's take Nakamoto consensus. Let's take Bitcoin's protocol and just change a bit of it to be more careful about what the community knows. What node do I have as a participant in the protocol about what other people know in the protocol? And you can think of this kind of in two stages. Ideally, you want to kind of automating the community response within the protocol. You want that if the nodes are sure what other nodes know too, they can just resolve it automatically. You don't need to go on Twitter to say, how do we respond to the attack, if we all know what the response will be and we're sure of it. But we also find, again, consistent with Nusrat's impossibility result, that some community help is necessary. And we kind of bend the assumptions a bit and say, well, we think this is a feasible thing. Okay? So the first idea is, let's put conflict detection. So even though we don't have a protocol with certificate, we have a protocol where nodes are completely anonymous, the miners are completely anonymous. You can still think of a block that's deep enough as kind of some sort of certificate. You need to be a bit careful about what other nodes saw, but I'll show you in the next slide. But you can detect the potential for conflicts in a careful enough way that's not overly permissive. You're not going to stop all the time. You're just going to stop where there's real danger. And that gives you a protocol that halts, that is always safe, but sometimes just halts. And then the obvious question is like, well, can we recover? And we say you can recover. That requires help of an additional element that we kind of think of as help from the community. We call it a recovery oracle. And we try to be careful of saying what exactly are the properties of this recovery oracle that we need, both in terms of is it feasible to implement, and does it give too much power to any single entity that diminishes the openness of the protocol or the economic properties that we want. So I have like 2 minutes, right? So let me go through the protocol pretty quickly. The idea is take Nakamoto, take Bitcoin's protocol, make all the nodes agree on what is the depth that you need to finalize. So this is going to be some K, 6 deep. And now we're going to call a block certified if it achieved the 6 deep status, 6 deep in the longest chain. And we're going to have a different criteria called potentially certified, 2 delta potentially certified. I'm not going to go into this definition, but this is given what I see, is it possible for somebody to have certified a different block? So I want to be a bit careful that other people saw maybe something that's slightly different than the chain that I saw. You can do that by kind of trying to look at what you saw and rolling back a bit, but this is sufficient to detect conflicts. And an illustration of the protocol is just certify a block, wait to see whether you got a conflict. If you got a conflict, then just halt, wait for recovery. If not, you're safe to finalize. And then there's another step that makes the recovery a bit nicer, that if you wait a bit longer, it can be kind of guaranteed that everybody else is in sync with you. And this protocol gives us that under synchrony, the same assumption as Bitcoin. And assuming that everybody is online, then we have consistency always. It's impossible to detect the protocol, and it basically has the same liveness as Nakamoto. Okay? So if you have honest majority, you basically should never see the conflicts. And you can think of this as changing Nakamoto only off path, only in case of an attack. How to resolve it? Well, this protocol says in the case of an attack, you should be able to just at least figure out that an attack happened before anybody finalized something they shouldn't have, and you're never deceived. You see that there's a risk of deception, and you're never deceived. One thing that's interesting about it is the proof does not require anything about the mining rewards. So you don't need to pay anything to the miners. It's not about the miner cost. It's just the fact that if there's conflicts, potential conflicts in the system, we will be able to see that. And of course, the gossip is very important for that. And at the high level, the intuition is kind of simple. The protocol just makes sure that if I'm some node, if I'm node I, and I just finalized, I'm not completely sure what other nodes have been seeing, but I know that there may be some delta behind me, some delta before me. And this delay makes sure that like my uncertainty about other node is very bounded. And it's impossible for my uncertainty about some other nodes to be so big that I will allow somebody to contradict me. Yeah, so this is for online nodes, if everybody's online all the time. If we have late joiners, nodes that join the protocol after being sleepy, then they cannot use the same kind of delay and synchrony to detect but the kind of standard protocols will also give you if you assume that they really cannot see anything, you're also assuming that they cannot distinguish Bitcoin from Bitcoin Cash once you try to connect to one of them. So should wrap up, but we get some positive results as long as you think that the nodes that are joining that are already in any way relying on somebody to know which chain are they trying to connect to, well, they should at least have some knowledge if some catastrophic event happened in the past and the node halted, and that should be enough to guarantee consistency. And if you want to recover, then we have this model of a recover oracle, and we say that if you have something that's pretty easy to implement, you just need one node to be able to certify this. Let me show this slide. Okay. So if you have one node that is honest, and that serves as sort of like a tiebreaker when we're not completely sure what happened when everybody halted, that's sufficient to do recovery. It's necessary because some tie-breaking must be, may be necessary, may be required when you recover, but the tie-breaking, the resolution of ambiguity between the nodes that potentially halted is up to just like a small amount of delay that could be possible. So we think that this kind of recovery oracle is in some sense a pretty sensible way to resolve this tension, saying you can't get the perfect system that you may have wanted to, but it's pretty close to that. Yeah, so sorry for having too many slides, given that out of time. So we try to think of like this technology as a platform that we can use for financial systems, trying to think about what kind of economic properties we would like to get out of those protocols. The first ones that we focused on is the system should be open in the sense of free entry and should be secure. And of course, there's many things. This is just one building block. So many other things that you would like to get from that. We got that incentives are going to have various deficiencies, but you can get security and this free entry property under a design that leverages like the knowledge that nodes have about each other and detecting conflict and when needed doing conflict resolution. And the 3 icons on the slide are 2 examples that I think are good kind of northern stars for this industry for what should we do with this permissionless protocols. And one is a organization to avoid being. I won't say which is which.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. So there is we have one question in the Q&A. I don't know whether you can say, oh, actually no, the second question now. I don't know whether you can see the question, but maybe I will read it out loud from David. Jacob, here and in your paper on pages 4 and 5, you argue that economic security requires verifiability, but indirect mechanisms like Grove's Latayard are proven incentive compatible with Pareto optimality and yet cannot be observed or verified as such ex post, since they cannot even theoretically be converted to direct mechanism via the revelation principle. Why is verifiability needed for economic security if it isn't needed to establish incentive compatibility?
I'm not sure I follow the question, but they never argue that you must have verifiability. Right? Like the protocol that I suggested is not trying to detect attacker. Accountability is a very potent tool for kind of establishing good incentives and securing. I think that's a great approach. But the approach we take here does not require accountability. It just says like an attacker will not be able to create deception because the users will be able to see that there's no guarantee that what they finalize is the same as somebody else.
So it's a sufficient, maybe not necessary.
Yeah, as far as I understand from the question, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I mean, it's open up for more questions, but so David also has some additional comments here in the Q&A box, but I mean, if nothing else, this was a very interesting, insightful session, and thank you very much, and thank you everyone else. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.